Night hiking was a stupid idea. I knew it, but at that moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stopped for the night, I would lose too much time on my through hike in Tennessee. I had to keep moving. The miles, the progress, it all mattered. I wasn't going to let something as trivial as the dark slow me down. The Appalachian Trail stretched out ahead of me like an endless ribbon, and there was something about the challenge that pulled at me, making me push forward. It was late, the kind of late when the air feels thick and still, and the forest around me seemed to close in. The trees, tall and looming, stood like silent sentinels, their branches whispering in the wind, swaying with a rhythmic motion that almost lulled me to sleep. I had a good headlamp, one of the bright LED models that could cut through the darkest night, and I kept a steady pace as I made my way along the narrow trail. I was used to hiking alone at this point. The solitude was almost comforting. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the earth and the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals scurried out of the way. It felt like I was the only person left on the planet. About an hour in, I caught movement to my left. A flash of pale skin, like someone had just ducked behind a tree. I froze mid-step, my heart kicking up a notch. I had gotten used to the weird sounds and odd sights on the trail, but this was different. The flash of white skin was too real, too close. My headlamp swung toward the spot, but I couldn't see anything clearly at first. I stood there for a second, just trying to make sense of what I'd seen. My breath was steady, but my mind was racing. Could it have been an animal? A deer? Maybe? No, it didn't feel like that. It was too intentional, too human. My pulse quickened. The night around me felt suddenly heavier, like the weight of the forest was pressing down on me. "Hello!" I called out, louder than I meant to. The sound of my voice startled me, echoing through the woods, but I didn't care. I had to know. Was it someone else on the trail, maybe another hiker who had gotten off course? Or something else entirely? I took a step forward, toward the spot where I'd seen the movement. Nothing. No reply, no sign of life. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity. My heart was thumping hard now, my eyes scanning the darkness in a frantic search for any sign of movement. Then I saw it. The figure. They were standing behind a tree, just barely visible. Only half their face and shoulder peeked out from behind the bark, as though they were trying to stay hidden, watching me. Their features were indistinct, like a shadow in the night, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was out there. I froze, my mind a jumble of thoughts. Was this a person who had gotten lost or someone trying to do something more sinister? Couldn't tell, but I wasn't about to just ignore it. Not here, not now. Not after what had happened the other times I'd hiked in the backcountry. Alone. "Are you okay?" I called out again, my voice tight in my throat. "Hey, you good?" I didn't know what else to say. I wanted to sound calm, but inside I was anything but. My breath was shallow, my feet rooted to the trail. The figure didn't move. No response. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something unsettling about how still they were. It was almost like they were waiting for me to do something, waiting for me to make the first move. I took a step closer, but as soon as I did, the figure ducked behind the tree. It was so fast, like they were trying to make themselves vanish. I felt a lump rise in my throat. What was happening? Was it a trick of the light? A hallucination from fatigue and hunger? Or was it something more? I moved cautiously, slowly rounding the tree to where I thought they had been standing. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the wind dying down, leaving an eerie silence. The tree's bark was cold beneath my hand as I touched it, peering around it with my light. There was no one there. I scanned the surrounding area, sweeping my headlamp over the trees and the underbrush, trying to make out any sign of the figure. But the woods were still, quiet, empty, nothing, no one. I stood there for a moment, the beam of my light cutting through the darkness like a knife, but I saw nothing out of place. The woods had returned to their normal, almost peaceful state. I had been wrong. It had just been a trick of the light, a blur in the trees. Or so I told myself. I shook my head, forcing my nerves to settle. It was nothing. Maybe I was getting too tired. Maybe the dark was playing tricks on me. I had hiked hundreds of miles, and I knew my mind could play tricks when it was worn down. But this didn't feel like that. Felt too real. But there was no point in standing here second-guessing myself. I was on a mission to finish this section of the trail. I couldn't let something as small as a shadow throw me off track. So, I sucked in a deep breath, adjusted my pack, and set off again, my boots crunching against the leaves as I continued my hike. The trail twisted and turned, the darkness closing in as I pressed on, each step bringing me further from the place where I'd seen the figure. But the unsettling feeling stayed with me, creeping along in the back of my mind like a shadow of its own. I kept thinking back to that moment, the way the figure had ducked behind the tree, the way they hadn't responded when I called out. It was like they didn't want to be noticed, but they were watching me, waiting to see if I would stop. As I hiked, the minutes seemed to stretch into hours. My headlamp illuminated the trail ahead, but the woods on either side remained cloaked in shadow. The trees were still, the ground soft beneath my boots. The further I went, the more the silence wrapped around me, pressing in, making every sound seem louder, sharper. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves, felt like it was coming from someone or something just beyond my sight. But I kept moving. 10 miles later, I finally reached a point where I could stop. I didn't even think about it at first, but my body had been telling me to rest for a while. My muscles were sore, my legs aching from the relentless rhythm of hiking, and my mind was still running, trying to make sense of what had happened earlier. I set up camp quickly, the light of my headlamp flickering as I unrolled my sleeping bag and set my gear down. My mind kept racing, replaying that moment when I'd seen the figure, wondering if they were still out there, somewhere, watching me. But there was no point in worrying. I wasn't going to let it stop me. I had a job to do, and tomorrow, I'd be back on the trail, knocking out more miles. As I lay in my tent, listening to the night sounds of the forest, distant owl calls, the rustle of leaves in the wind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but I pushed it aside. There was no sense in dwelling on it. It wasn't until the next morning that I realized what had happened. When I started back on the trail, I saw a faint footprint in the mud. It was just outside my campsite, clear as day, as if someone had been standing there, just watching me sleep. The footprint was fresh, not more than a few hours old, and it wasn't mine. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise again, the unsettling sensation creeping back into my bones. But I didn't stop. I kept walking. I wasn't going to let fear rule me. Not now, not after everything I'd been through on the trail. I hiked on, telling myself that I'd be fine. Whoever that person was, whatever they were doing, I didn't know. But I didn't think they were trying to scare me. I don't think they were trying to hurt me either. They were just watching, waiting to see if I would stop. And when I kept going, they disappeared back into the woods, blending in with the shadows, just like the trail itself. I didn't stop. Not once. Not until I reached the next shelter, where the trail was crowded again with other hikers. And even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, in the woods, waiting to see if I'd stop. But I didn't. I kept going, because the trail doesn't care. It just keeps moving forward, and so do I. I'd always considered myself a seasoned hiker. Years of exploring the rugged trails of the Adirondacks had sharpened my skills. I knew how to read a map, follow a trail, and even find my way off trail when I needed to. But that day, when I ventured off the beaten path, I ended up somewhere I shouldn't have been. Somewhere that made me question my entire understanding of the woods. It started out as a normal hike. I was on the outskirts of one of the more isolated sections of the Adirondacks, an area less traveled and far from any marked trails. I'd planned to take a detour off the usual route, mostly out of curiosity. Sometimes you stumble upon the most interesting places when you go off track, and I was hoping this would be one of those times. The trees were dense here, but the ground was soft, the kind of earth that welcomes your boots but doesn't suck them in. The light filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground. I hadn't seen anyone in hours, no other hikers, No signs of wildlife beyond the usual rustling of squirrels and the occasional crow overhead. I relished the solitude. The beauty of being alone in the woods had always felt comforting to me. The quiet was peaceful in a way that made my thoughts seem less urgent. The only sound was my own footsteps crunching softly on the forest floor. I kept walking, losing track of time as I moved deeper into the forest. I wasn't in any rush. It wasn't until I noticed the small clearing ahead of me that I realized I'd wandered much farther off trail than I intended. A clearing in the woods is always a strange thing to find, like a little pocket of civilization hidden away from the world. As I approached, I noticed something that didn't belong. A campsite. It was small, simple. A tent was set up on the edge of the clearing, but it wasn't the typical setup I'd expect from someone who was here for a few days. The fire pit was still warm, the stones surrounding it blackened and charred, but there was no fire, and the smoke had long since dissipated. The smell of burned wood hung faintly in the air. What caught my attention more than anything was the food bag, hanging from a tree just a few feet from the tent. The bag was heavy-looking, a tightly tied-up bear bag designed to keep food out of reach of wildlife. It was hanging a little higher than usual, almost as if someone had been in a hurry to get it up there. But there were no signs of struggle or signs of animals trying to get into it. I called out into the open air, thinking maybe someone was nearby, but the only response was the soft whisper of the wind. I waited for a few seconds, then called out again. Still nothing. The silence felt wrong, almost too still, too quiet. I stepped forward, peering around the campsite. There was a tarp spread out on the ground, folded neatly at the edges as if it had been left in a hurry. My gaze moved to the sleeping bag. It was half-zipped, lying on the tarp as if someone had abruptly gotten out of it, leaving it behind in a rush. The sleeping bag looked used, worn, and there was dirt on the bottom edge, as though someone had gotten in and out of it multiple times without bothering to clean it. I didn't like the feeling settling in my stomach. Something wasn't right here. I looked around the site again, searching for any sign of who might have been here. There were no footprints leading off in any direction, no clues as to who had been camping here. The place was eerily neat, considering someone had clearly been using it recently. The crackling fire pit, the hanging food, the tarp, all of it pointed to a person who had left in a hurry. As I approached the tent, I noticed something on the ground. Camera. It was lying on the dirt, its screen cracked, and the lens facing up toward the sky. I crouched down beside it, picking it up carefully. The plastic felt brittle in my hand. I tried to turn it on, but the screen stayed dark. It didn't seem like it had been dropped accidentally. The way it was positioned suggested someone had placed it there, maybe as a last-minute thought before walking away. I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be there. The whole site felt wrong. There were no signs of life, no animals around, no people, not even a single bird call. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural in the woods. I made the decision to leave the campsite as I found it. I didn't want to touch anything else, didn't want to disturb whatever had happened here. My instincts were telling me to get out, and I wasn't one to ignore them. I backed away slowly from the site, my mind racing with questions. Where had the person gone? Why had they left so abruptly? Why hadn't they packed up their things? I hiked quickly back toward the nearest ranger station, the sense of unease growing with every step. The woods, which had once felt so welcoming, now felt oppressive. The trees closed in on me, their shadows lengthening as the day wore on. I couldn't shake the image of the half-zipped sleeping bag, the abandoned camera, the fire pit that was still warm. Something about the whole thing gnawed at me. When I finally reached the ranger station, I reported what I had found. I told them about the campsite, the tent, the food bag, and the camera. The rangers seemed interested but skeptical. They took down my information and GPS coordinates, but I couldn't help but notice the look they exchanged when I mentioned the cracked camera. They didn't seem overly concerned, but I felt the weight of my story in the air, something that made me uneasy even as I left. They assured me they would send someone to check it out, though they warned me that it could take a while. "We haven't had anyone register in that area in 2 weeks," one of them said. "It's a pretty remote section. Could be someone just wandered off or they left voluntarily. You know how people can be." I tried not to let the words bother me, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. If no one had registered who had been out there, had they left voluntarily, or had something else happened? I couldn't stop thinking about the tarp, the sleeping bag, the camera. It all felt too strange. A week later, I got a call from the ranger station. They told me they couldn't find the campsite. They had followed the GPS coordinates I provided and searched the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of the site. No tent, no fire pit, no food bag hanging from a tree, nothing at all. They told me it was just open woods, just trees and dirt, with no indication that anyone had been there recently. I didn't know what to think. How could something that had been so clearly there just vanish? I'd seen it with my own eyes. I'd stood there in the clearing. I touched the camera. I called out into the silence. But according to the rangers, there was nothing. It was like it had never existed. The idea that I had somehow imagined the whole thing crossed my mind, but I knew that wasn't true. I wasn't the type to make up stories, especially not about something that scared me this much. I'd been hiking for years, and I knew the difference between the unsettling quiet of the woods and the feeling of being somewhere I shouldn't be. I had been in places far more remote than that, but nothing had ever felt so off. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time I went out into the woods after that, my mind would drift back to that campsite. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, something important I wasn't understanding. But as time passed, I realized there was nothing more I could do. The campsite was gone, and no one else had reported it. It wasn't something I could prove, not to anyone else at least. Maybe the truth was that some things in the woods were better left unexplained. Maybe some places weren't meant to be found, and the woods had a way of hiding things when they didn't want to be discovered. As for me, I never hiked in that area again. I couldn't bring myself to go back, not with that lingering feeling of unease. I still hike the Adirondacks, but I've learned to trust that some trails are better left untraveled. I'm one of those people who likes to get out into nature and get away from everything. There's something peaceful about the mountains. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds. It's the kind of quiet you can only find when you leave behind the chaos of everyday life. For me, it's more than just a hobby. It's how I clear my head. But even though I love being out there, I never hike solo without a safety net. So I carry a small ham radio with me, just in case. I'm not some survivalist or anything, just someone who likes to be cautious. A quick check-in to make sure the weather's good, or if something goes wrong, I've got a lifeline to the outside world. It's a basic setup, compact enough to slip into my backpack and light enough to forget it's even there most of the time. It's just one of those things I've carried for years, never really needing it, until that weekend. I had driven up to Boise the Friday before, picked out a nice spot high up in the mountains. There were some decent hiking trails that would take me deep into the forest, miles from the nearest road. It was early fall, the air crisp with a chill that hadn't quite settled into the ground yet, but there was still that warmth that hints at the summer passing by. I'd always loved this time of year. That first night, I set up camp just before sunset. A small tent, my sleeping bag, and a camp stove. Nothing extravagant, just enough to make myself comfortable. I had a few snacks, a good book, and a flask of coffee. The kind of night I loved, quiet, still, just me and the mountains. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the crackling wood and watching the flames dance. After the fire started to die down, I zipped myself into my tent and decided to check the weather, just to be sure nothing was coming in overnight. I pulled out the ham radio and turned it on. The device hummed to life, static crackling briefly before I adjusted the frequency. The weather reports were clear, like always. Nothing unusual there. But then I heard it, a voice clear through the static. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? Please." I froze. I wasn't expecting any transmission at all, let alone something like that. I checked the frequency again, thinking maybe I had accidentally tuned into some random station or someone's private channel. But it was the same voice, saying the same thing. "Hello? Can anyone hear me? Please." It wasn't anything out of the ordinary at first. Maybe just someone testing their radio or a prank. I keyed up and responded just like I've done in the past when I've heard others on the airwaves. Hello? This is / my name. I hear you. Are you in trouble? Nothing. The voice just kept repeating the same thing. Hello? Can anyone hear me? Please. The tone of it was off. It was urgent, sure, but it wasn't panicked, not like someone in real distress would sound. It was almost mechanical. The same words, same inflection, same timing. It didn't change. It didn't evolve. And that's when I started to feel uneasy. At first, I thought it could be a glitch, some kind of feedback loop or automated transmission from someone with a malfunctioning radio. But it was more than that. I started listening closely, really paying attention. The repetition wasn't just the same message. It was the exact same phrasing with the same pauses, the same tone. It was looping. It was like the message had been recorded, and whoever was behind it wasn't even aware they were playing it over and over. I turned the volume down a little, feeling a knot grow in my stomach. I tried again, keying the mic to see if anyone would respond. Nothing, just the same message repeating. Hello? Can anyone hear me? Please. I began to wonder if maybe it wasn't a prank, but something else. Something I didn't understand. It wasn't human, not in the way a person should be. It sounded human, but there was something wrong. It wasn't the voice of someone in distress. It was too perfect, too rehearsed. No variation in the pitch or cadence. It didn't feel like a real plea for help. It felt like a recording, a trap. My mind began to race. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about it. It's hard to explain. You know when you're in the wilderness and everything's quiet, so quiet that every little sound seems amplified. That's how it was. This voice cutting through the silence, piercing it like a needle. My instincts told me something was wrong. I turned the radio off. The silence that followed was deafening. The kind of silence you only get when you've been disturbed by something you can't explain. I laid back in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, trying to calm myself down. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe it was just some weird radio transmission. There were plenty of strange things that could happen out in the mountains, but I couldn't shake it. The voice, the repetition, it wasn't right. I spent the next few minutes wrestling with myself. Was I being paranoid? Was it nothing more than a strange radio glitch? Maybe I was just tired. I had hiked a good distance that day, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. It was too easy to dismiss it as nothing. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how it didn't make sense. I've been in situations where radios had static and weird signals, but this wasn't that. This was something different. I didn't want to stay out there, not after that. I wasn't the type to get scared easily, but something about this felt wrong. So I decided to pack up camp. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I couldn't sleep with that voice in my head, repeating the same thing over and over. The weather was good, so there was no reason to stay, no reason to put myself at risk by letting whatever was out there just hang over me. I shut the radio off, packed my gear quickly, and started hiking back down the trail. I wasn't going to stick around. The voice, that repeating message, it kept echoing in my head as I made my way through the trees, my backpack heavier than it had been before, not because of the gear, but because of the unease that settled in my chest. The trail was mostly downhill, which should have been a relief, but I was moving faster than I usually did, my pace quickening as the minutes passed. I wasn't scared. I don't scare easily, but something about that moment, that voice, it had lodged itself in my brain. I wasn't looking over my shoulder, but I could feel eyes on me. It was like someone was watching me from just out of sight, the kind of feeling you get when you know something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. I kept my focus on the trail, breathing steadily, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that voice. Hello? Can anyone hear me? Please. The repetition, the lack of emotion. It didn't sound like a real person. It didn't sound like anything I'd ever heard before. And that thought alone kept me moving faster. It took me 3 hours to get back to the car, a record time for that trail. I didn't stop once, didn't take a break. I just kept going. My legs ached by the time I reached the trailhead, but there was a sense of relief when I saw the parking lot in the distance. The trees started to thin out, and I could see the familiar dirt road stretching toward my car. When I reached my car, I didn't hesitate. I threw my pack in the back, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. I didn't care about anything else. I wasn't going to stay out there any longer. I drove down the winding mountain road, my hands gripping the wheel a little too tight, the engine hum filling the car. My mind was still racing, but as I descended the mountain, I began to feel the tension in my shoulders start to ease, little by little. The voice faded from my thoughts, and I tried to convince myself it had just been a weird fluke, that nothing was wrong. But the voice still lingered, not as a whisper, not as something I could hear, but as something I could feel. It was in the back of my mind, like a cold finger on the back of my neck, and I couldn't shake it. I didn't know what I had heard, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't something that was meant for me to hear. I haven't been back to those mountains since. We had been hiking for days through the Colorado Rockies, tackling a long loop trail that had become more rugged and remote the further we went. The first 2 days had been smooth, filled with quiet mornings and challenging ascents, but nothing compared to the eerie silence that fell over us on the third night. That night, we made camp in a small, isolated valley. The day had been long, and the sun had just dipped behind the towering peaks when we finally stopped to set up our tents. We didn't see anyone else around, not for miles. We built a small fire, the crackling flames a welcome distraction after hours of trekking. The air had cooled considerably, and the night was thick with the scent of pine and earth. We settled around the fire, each of us too tired to talk much, and began to eat our dinner, our voices muffled by the comforting warmth of the fire and the heavy silence of the woods. That's when it happened. My friend Ben, who had been sitting across from me, suddenly dropped his spoon with a clatter. His face drained of color, and his eyes widened as he stared into the trees just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Don't move." His voice was barely a whisper, and it sent an immediate chill down my spine. We all froze, not daring to make a sound. My eyes instinctively followed his gaze, darting into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, just the usual outline of trees and rocks. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. There were eyes, green, glowing faintly in the darkness, low to the ground, reflecting the flames in a way that made them seem unnatural. They were steady, unmoving, a pair of them, no more than 30 feet away. Then I saw another pair, and another, and another, 5 pairs in total, scattered between the trees, all watching us. They blinked, but they didn't move, not even a twitch. They just stayed there, fixed in place, staring. I felt my pulse quicken, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear my breath in my ears, and I noticed Ben's knuckles were white, gripping the edge of his seat on the log. We didn't speak. None of us did. We just stared back at the eyes, all of us frozen in place, not daring to make a sound. Ben slowly reached for a rock that had been lying near his feet. He tossed it towards the trees, hoping to scare whatever it was away, but it landed with a soft thud and didn't disturb the creatures, or whatever they were, at all. The eyes blinked again, slowly, but that was all. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered, though I'm not sure who it was. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadows, the low, glowing eyes that seemed to be multiplying the longer I stared. We sat there for what felt like an eternity, the fire crackling in the background, but the night air growing colder by the second. The eyes didn't move, they just watched. The tension was unbearable. Finally, we all seemed to come to the same conclusion without saying a word. It wasn't worth testing it any further. "Put out the fire," Ben said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. His hand was shaking as he reached for his pack, grabbing a water bottle to douse the flames. We didn't argue. The fire quickly died down, and the surrounding forest sank into an inky blackness. The quiet felt deafening. We climbed into the tent as quickly as we could, hands trembling, our weapons within reach, our knives, a small pistol that Ben had brought just in case. We zipped up the tent and lay there, not speaking, barely breathing. Outside, the night was dead quiet. There were no animal sounds, no wind rustling through the trees, no chirping insects, just silence. It was as if the forest had gone completely still, holding its breath. The night dragged on, and I don't know how long we lay awake in that tent, staring into the darkness, listening for any sign of movement. We tried to stay as quiet as possible, not daring to disturb whatever might be out there, waiting. By the time the first light of dawn finally crept through the thin fabric of the tent, none of us had slept. We were all on edge, our eyes bloodshot from the long, sleepless night. When the light hit our faces, it was almost a relief, but the memories of the eyes that never moved, stayed with me. We didn't want to leave the safety of the tent, but eventually, hunger and the need to keep moving forced us out into the open. I can't explain it, but something felt off as I unzipped the door. The air was crisp, but there was no breeze. Everything was still. The first thing we noticed when we stepped out of the tent was the lack of tracks. There should have been footprints, scat, something that showed we weren't the only ones around. But there was nothing. No fresh tracks, no signs of any animals moving through the area. Nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had seen the night before wasn't normal. Maybe it had been some wild animals, but they should have been moving, leaving signs of their presence. And yet, there was nothing. Not even a broken twig, not a paw print in the dirt. But then we saw the drag marks. They were faint, almost imperceptible at first, like something had been pulled through the forest floor. Long, deep marks cut through the thick carpet of pine needles. It was as if something had been dragged along the ground, and it had left a noticeable trail in the soft earth. We followed them, the drag marks leading off into the woods, parallel to the edge of the clearing where we had set up camp. The marks twisted and turned, weaving between the trees, heading deeper into the forest. They didn't seem to follow any natural path or animal trail. They were erratic, inconsistent, as if whatever had been dragged had been pulled along with little care for direction. There were no additional signs of anything moving through the area, no other prints to accompany the drag marks, just the marks themselves and the chilling realization that whatever had made them was still out there. We stood there for a long time, staring at the marks, none of us wanting to be the first to speak. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to look away from the trail. "What the hell is that?" Ben's voice broke the silence, but it was empty, hollow, as if he were asking more for confirmation than for an answer. We didn't stay long. No one said anything, but we all knew it was time to go. We packed up our camp as quickly as possible, our movements stiff and hurried, our eyes constantly scanning the trees around us. We didn't talk as we broke down the tents, not wanting to disturb the uneasy quiet that surrounded us. As we made our way down the trail, the forest seemed to close in around us, the towering trees pressing in from all sides. The sun was up now, but the eerie feeling of the previous night stayed with us. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, made us jump. We never talked about what had happened that night, not even when we got back to the trailhead and were safely in the parking lot. We just packed up our gear and left, the drive back to the city silent and tense. To this day, I don't know what we saw that night in the Colorado Rockies. We never found tracks, never found any clear explanation for the eyes we saw or the drag marks in the forest. But we all knew something had been out there with us, something we couldn't understand, something that didn't belong in the woods. And for the rest of the trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, following us, waiting for the next opportunity to reveal itself. But we never went back to that place. I don't think any of us ever will. The night had settled in, deep and thick, over the high desert of eastern Oregon. I had chosen the spot carefully, finding a small, secluded area near a series of old volcanic cliffs. The landscape was barren and rugged, with nothing but sagebrush stretching out in all directions. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faintest glimmer of twilight on the edges of the sky. I pitched my tent, the process slow but steady, as the wind picked up, whispering across the dry earth and rocks. I had been on my own for a few days now, hiking solo in the stark wilderness, looking for solitude. There was something about the isolation that pulled me in, the challenge of being completely alone in a place that seemed as old as time itself. The cliffs loomed behind me, ancient and jagged, casting long shadows as the darkness crept in. By the time I finished setting up camp, the wind had picked up, gusting stronger, howling through the rocks like a giant's breath. It was a strange sound, almost musical in its intensity, the wind rushing through the narrow passes between the cliffs, producing a sound like a giant pipe organ. It seemed to reverberate off the rocks, making everything feel alive, as though the desert itself were breathing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the wind seemed to pick up speed, the howling growing louder and more forceful. I crawled into my tent, securing the flap, and lay back on my sleeping pad, listening to the wind outside. It felt unnervingly alive, as though the desert was trying to speak to me, to tell me something. I tried to push the thought out of my head, focusing instead on the steady rhythm of the wind. My thoughts wandered, and I found myself drifting into a restless sleep, only half aware of the passage of time. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. At first, I couldn't place what had disturbed my sleep. The wind had shifted, now coming from a different direction, howling and whistling through the cracks and crevices of the cliffs. But there was something else. A voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but then it grew louder, more distinct. "Hey!" The word cracked through the air like a sharp whisper, cutting through the howling wind. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. The voice had come from the direction of the cliffs. My first thought was that someone was in trouble, maybe a hiker, lost or injured. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, and unzipped the flap of my tent. The air outside was cold, biting, and the wind was relentless, almost as if it were pushing against me. I shivered as I stepped out, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I scanned the surrounding area, nothing. Just the rolling sagebrush, twisted and bent by the wind, and the jagged cliffs in the distance. I called out, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "Hello? Is someone out there?" Nothing. No response. Only the howling wind. I felt my stomach twist with unease. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the wind had played tricks on me, creating the sound of a voice where there was none. I took a few hesitant steps forward, sweeping the light across the ground. No footprints, no signs of anything that would suggest a person had passed by. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it, but nothing seemed to add up. The landscape was empty, desolate. There was no sign of life, not even a coyote or a bird, just rocks and dust. Then, almost as suddenly as it had started, the wind stopped. It wasn't a gradual thing either. One moment it was howling, the next it was dead silent. Complete and utter silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you, makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. It was unnatural, almost oppressive. I stood there, frozen, listening. Not a single sound. No wind, no rustling sagebrush. Not even the distant hum of a plane or the chirp of a night bird. Just silence. Then, in that silence, I heard it again. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A voice, clear as day, whispering into the still air. "Go back inside." The words were slow, deliberate, and chilling. They seemed to resonate deep in my chest, sending a shiver down my spine. I froze, the flashlight in my hand now feeling useless. The silence was thick, pressing in on me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. It wasn't fear that gripped me exactly, but something deeper. An instinctual understanding that whatever had spoken those words wasn't something I wanted to encounter. I turned back to the tent, my legs feeling unsteady as I stumbled towards it. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I fumbled with the zipper, my heart racing. I didn't even look back. I crawled into the safety of the tent, zipped it up quickly, and lay there, breathing heavily, trying to calm my thoughts. For what felt like hours, I lay awake, listening to the silence. The wind had not returned. The voice, too, was gone. But the unease lingered, a heavy presence that I couldn't shake. My mind raced with thoughts. Had I imagined it? Was it the wind? Had I simply heard something that my brain couldn't quite process? But no, those words, so clear, so distinct. There was no mistaking it. I lay there, staring into the dark, my eyes wide open, straining to hear any sound, anything that would break the silence. But nothing came. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. I could feel my eyes growing heavy, but I didn't dare close them. Every creak of the tent, every rustle of fabric, made me tense. I didn't want to sleep. I didn't want to let my guard down. The night dragged on, and I kept myself awake, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. Eventually, I could feel the faintest light of dawn creeping over the horizon. The first hints of morning broke through the darkness, casting a pale glow over the landscape. By the time the sun had fully risen, I felt safe enough to relax, though I still couldn't shake the tension in my body. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, blinking in the bright light of day. The wind had returned, but now it was just a normal breeze, nothing like the oppressive howl of the night before. I scanned the landscape again, the cliffs standing silent and unmoving in the distance. No footprints, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. The desert was empty, as it had always been, but the feeling remained. Something was off, something I couldn't explain. The voice, the silence, the way the wind had stopped so suddenly, it didn't sit right. It didn't make sense. I packed up my camp quickly, my hands moving with a sense of urgency that I couldn't quite explain. The thought of staying there another night seemed impossible. Even though the sun was now bright and warm, I didn't want to linger. I needed to leave. As I hiked away, heading towards the nearest town, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the cliffs. But there was nothing, just the vast, empty desert, stretching out endlessly in all directions. By the time I made it back to civilization, I tried to push the experience from my mind. But the memory of the voice, the silence, and the strange presence of the night lingered. I never did figure out what had happened. I never spoke about it to anyone, not even my closest friends. It was one of those things that didn't quite make sense but stayed with you, like an itch that you couldn't scratch, a feeling that never quite goes away. I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never camp near those cliffs again. I had been planning the hike for months, section hiking part of the Pacific Northwest Trail. I'd done a lot of research beforehand, checked the weather reports, packed all the essentials, and plotted out my route. I had my GPS, a printed map, and the trail was supposed to be well marked, so I felt confident. I've hiked in remote areas before, but there was something about this stretch of the Pacific Northwest Trail that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation or the vast, untouched wilderness surrounding me, but I knew I'd have to stay focused. It was early in the morning when I set off. The cool air felt crisp, and the sun had just started peeking over the horizon. I'd read that this part of the trail was known for its dense forests, occasional views of lakes, and steep climbs. I'd been hiking for hours, and the well-maintained trail was exactly what I expected. A mix of dirt paths and wooden boardwalks, signs marking the miles, and the sound of birds overhead. I was in my element. Around midday, I passed a trail sign that read, Mile 136. I glanced at it for a second, making a mental note to check my GPS later, but I didn't think too much about it. The trail was wide and smooth at that point, winding through a stretch of forest with tall trees blocking out most of the sun. There was a slight chill in the air, and the only sound besides my footsteps was the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees above. I kept walking, making steady progress. A few hours later, I passed another sign, but this time it said, Mile 136 again. Same font, same post, and the angle of the sign in the ground seemed identical to the one I'd seen earlier. I stopped, puzzled for a moment. Maybe it was a mistake. It wasn't uncommon to see misprinted signs on the trail, but this seemed too strange to be an error. I continued on, shaking it off. The trail started to get a little steeper as I ascended toward a ridge. I could see the occasional glimpse of distant peaks through the trees, and I felt my excitement building. But as I walked, I started to feel a little uneasy. The scenery wasn't changing much, and the signs marking the miles seemed to be repeating themselves. I passed another sign for mile 136. My heart rate ticked up just slightly. Couldn't be the same one, could it? I checked my GPS, still I was on track. It confirmed that I was heading in the right direction, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I continued hiking, moving through the dense brush and thick trees. It felt like the air was growing heavier with each step, and the trail was starting to feel a little less clear. The once well-maintained path had become more rugged and difficult to follow. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, so I decided to set up camp before it got too dark. I found a small clearing near a stream, and I quickly set up my tent, feeling an odd sense of relief as I built my camp for the night. The quiet of the forest around me was thick, and even the birds seemed to have stopped their calls. It was an eerie silence that made me uneasy. I sat down to eat, but I couldn't shake the thought of the repeating mile marker. My mind wandered back to the signs, each one saying, mile 136. I checked my GPS again, and the reading was strange. According to the device, I'd only moved about 1.2 miles in the last 6 hours. That was impossible. I had hiked much further than that. A cold chill ran down my spine as I thought about the math. I'd passed that same mile marker at least 3 times. How could that be? My GPS didn't make mistakes. I double-checked the map, tracing my route. Everything was in order. Nothing was out of place. I couldn't explain it, but something about the trail felt off. Maybe it was fatigue or the isolation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled back to the same spot. I tried to push the thought from my mind and crawled into my tent, but sleep didn't come easily. The silence outside my tent seemed to grow louder, the wind whistling through the trees. I lay awake for hours, staring at the roof of my tent, listening for any sounds of movement outside. When I woke up the next morning, the sky was still overcast, but the light was bright enough to signal a new day. I packed up camp quickly, anxious to put the strange events behind me. I decided to backtrack a little, thinking that maybe I'd missed a turn or misunderstood the trail's direction. I set off, retracing my steps through the dense forest, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After several hours of hiking, I found myself back at the same spot I had camped the night before. I had crossed the same section of the trail, yet the signs were still the same, mile 136. I felt my stomach twist with unease. I checked my GPS again. It was still showing that I hadn't made much progress. I had only moved a fraction of a mile since the previous day. Frustrated and confused, I continued along the trail, hoping to find some sort of explanation for what was happening. The day dragged on, and I found myself hiking through the same stretches of trees, seeing the same familiar terrain. I was starting to doubt my own sanity. It felt like I was stuck in some sort of loop, unable to break free. Finally, as the sun began to set, I passed another mile marker. This time, it read mile 135. I stopped dead in my tracks. It felt like a victory of sorts, but at the same time, it was unsettling. How had I ended up back at mile 135 after a full day of backtracking? I had walked for hours and crossed the same stretches of trail, yet it felt like no progress had been made. At that moment, I realized the truth. Something had gone wrong, something I couldn't explain. I wasn't sure if it was the trail itself or if I had somehow become disoriented, but I knew I couldn't continue on the section of the trail. I was far too shaken. I decided to turn back for good and head back to the nearest town. I made my way down the trail as quickly as I could, but it wasn't until I reached a road and finally saw signs of civilization that I truly began to feel relief. I knew I'd been walking in circles for hours, but I didn't understand why it had happened. Was it something with the GPS? Was it something about the trail itself, some sort of natural anomaly I couldn't understand? I'll never know, but I do know one thing. I'll never hike that section of the Pacific Northwest Trail again. The disorienting sense of time and place, the repeated mile markers, and the nagging feeling that I was being pulled back to the same spot, those things have stayed with me. It wasn't the wilderness or the rough terrain that scared me. It was the uncertainty, the confusion. It made me realize how fragile our perception of reality can be when we're alone in the wild. I've since hiked other sections of the Pacific Northwest Trail, but I make sure to avoid that stretch. The memory of that experience is burned into my mind, and I'm not sure if I'll ever truly understand what happened. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was something with the GPS or the trail itself. But the fact remains, I was stuck in a loop that I couldn't break, and that's something I'll never forget. I'd been hiking alone in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas for hours. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the trail. The air was thick with the earthy scent of pine and the hum of distant insects. I hadn't seen another soul all day. The trail had become less maintained as I ventured deeper into the mountains, and the further I went, the more isolated it felt. It was quiet, unnervingly so, with only the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional bird call to break the silence. I didn't mind the solitude. It's what I had come for, the peace, the quiet, the feeling of being completely removed from the world. I had spent the past few days in the wilderness, enjoying the stillness of the forest, the only company being my own thoughts and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the brush. But today, something felt different. There was a strange weight in the air, an almost imperceptible tension that I couldn't place. I stopped to rest for a moment, wiping sweat from my brow. I took a long swig from my water bottle and sat on a fallen log, trying to shake the unease that was creeping up my spine. After a few minutes, I stood up and continued along the trail, my boots crunching softly against the pine needles and dirt. The sun was sinking fast, and I knew I would have to set up camp soon if I didn't want to be hiking in the dark. That's when I saw it. A massive cedar tree standing alone in a small clearing off to the side of the trail. It was thick and twisted, its gnarled branches reaching up to the sky like claws. Something about it caught my eye, and I made my way toward it, curiosity pulling me in. As I got closer, I noticed something strange. Rusted chain links embedded deep into the bark of the tree. They looked old, like they'd been there for years, maybe decades, slowly becoming part of the tree as it grew. The chains were wrapped tightly around the trunk, as though someone had once bound the tree and left it to be swallowed by time. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the chains. There was something unsettling about it. Something wrong, though I couldn't quite explain why. My mind raced with questions. Who would have done this? Why? It didn't make sense. I had read about odd markings or strange practices in the woods before, but this was different. There was a heaviness to it, a sense of abandonment that lingered in the air, as if whatever had happened here was long gone, leaving nothing but a strange reminder in its wake. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the area around the tree. That's when I saw it. A ring of small bones scattered across the dirt at the base of the cedar. They were small, no larger than the bones of a rabbit or some other small creature, but they were arranged in a perfect circle. At first, I thought it might be the remains of some animal carcass, but as I knelt down to examine it, I realized it was something more deliberate. The bones weren't scattered haphazardly. They were placed with care, as if someone or something had intentionally arranged them in that shape. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had no idea what to make of it. My first instinct was to walk away, to leave it behind and pretend I hadn't seen anything unusual. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something important, something that wasn't meant to be found. After a long moment of hesitation, I slowly stood up and backed away from the tree, my gaze lingering on the bones as I did. I couldn't stop myself from looking over my shoulder as I continued down the trail, the unsettling feeling growing stronger with each step. By the time I found a good spot to camp, it was getting dark. The sky had deepened to a dark purple, and the last hints of daylight were slipping away. I quickly set up my tent, my hands moving almost mechanically as I shoved my gear into the small shelter and secured the rainfly. My thoughts kept drifting back to the cedar tree, to the rusted chains and the ring of bones. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, just a strange sight in the woods, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I started a small campfire and sat down beside it, staring into the flickering flames. The fire crackled and popped, but the forest around me remained eerily quiet. I was used to the sounds of nature: crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional distant call of an owl. But tonight, there was nothing. No wind, no animals, no sounds of movement at all. Just silence. As the night wore on, the temperature dropped, and I crawled into my tent, pulling the flap closed behind me. I zipped it up, but the sense of unease still lingered, the feeling that I was being watched. I lay on my back, staring up at the roof of the tent, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there. Something in the woods, just beyond the light of my campfire, waiting. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind and forced myself to close my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, the hairs on the back of my neck would rise, and I'd jerk awake, heart pounding. The sounds of the forest, which should have been comforting, now felt like a reminder that I was utterly alone. Hours passed. The fire burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow outside my tent. The air was thick with stillness. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but sleep refused to take me. Then, just as I was starting to drift into that half-conscious state between wakefulness and sleep, I heard it. A slow, deliberate step, crunching pine needles, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Another step, and then another. Whatever it was circling my tent. The heavy, measured steps seemed to come from all directions, moving deliberately around the edges of the camp, just out of sight. I could hear the pine needles cracking under the weight of each step, the sound unmistakable in the otherwise dead silence of the night. I held my breath, straining to hear. The steps continued, slow and methodical, as though whatever was out there was carefully evaluating the situation. I couldn't bring myself to move. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The steps circled my tent 3 times. Each time they grew louder, closer, as though the creature or person was slowly getting more and more comfortable. It was like they were testing me, waiting for a response. But I didn't make a sound. I stayed completely still, praying that whatever it was would just leave. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the steps stopped. Silence again, deep and absolute. My mind raced. Was it gone? Had it left? I couldn't bring myself to look outside. I didn't want to know, but the silence stretched on, growing deeper, more suffocating. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing stirred. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft glow across the clearing. I lay there for a while, still too shaken to move, my heart slowly returning to a normal rhythm. There was no sign of anything unusual outside the tent. The forest had returned to its usual quiet, peaceful state, as though the events of the night had never happened. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave the campsite behind. I didn't want to linger any longer in the place that had given me such an unsettling feeling. As I walked back along the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, watching from the trees. But there was nothing, just the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. When I finally reached the trailhead and emerged from the woods, the sun was fully up, and the world felt normal again. But the memory of the cedar tree, the rusted chains, and the bones haunted me. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong with that place. Something dark, something I had only barely touched on. And I was glad to be leaving it behind. But as I drove away from the Ouachita Mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who had walked away from that clearing. Whatever had been out there in the woods, circling my tent in the dark, had been waiting for something or someone, and I had no idea what it wanted. All I knew was that I had been lucky to leave without ever learning the answer.